Okay, hello and welcome to a primer on infantry theory. My name is Velth. My pronouns are he and him. Uh, this one, I know I said that I was going to go into theory more when I ran out of ideas for topics about trenches, um, but this is sort of a collision of multiple different things that I saw and comments, experiences that I had while playing the game. Um, and just the actual next topic that I wanted to talk about, which was a little bit of like going more in depth on why I build the trenches the way that I do and how they should get used. Um, so we're going to wind up digging into some theory here. It's going to be a longer one. Uh, you're going to have to just sort of deal with that. But hopefully, this will give you a good understanding of why a trench is used the way that I think it should be used. Obviously, all of this is sort of my opinion. There's certainly other ways that you can view these problems that are going to be equally valid. Just know that if you're going to go with a competing interpretation, you probably want to have like a reason for choosing that interpretation more so than just, well, there's another way to think about it. Um, so we're going to have to start this discussion, you know, with a question. What is the objective of the game? Um, and this is starting about as far back as you can in theory, but the objective of the game in Foxhole is, as most of you are probably aware, or maybe not because you just like shooting people and driving tanks and whatnot, but it's to capture the victory points on the map. These are town halls. Um, they have a rating between 0 and 3 stars, depending on how long they've been held and how much tech they've been able to gather. Um, and so the way that either faction wins is by capturing enough of these towns and holding them for sufficiently long for them to tech up to be worth a certain number of victory points, right? The first team to hold some majority of the victory points wins. I don't remember the exact number, but it's not important here. Um, and while this is, great, that's kind of such a high level objective that we may ask, what is the point of even noting it, right? And the point of noting it is that if your objective is to capture a town hall, ultimately, winning the game depends on dealing high explosive damage. High explosive damage is the only damage type capable of damaging structures. Um, and so having access to and knowing how you're going to bring high explosive damage to bear on a town hall really starts to inform the way that the rest of the game unfurls, right? I need to be able to deal some sort of HE damage to a town hall in order to capture it. So the first thing that the enemy's going to want to do is stop me from doing that, right? So secondary objective, destroy the things, probably the buildings, that the enemy is going to place between you and the town hall. Now, the reason why I'm focusing on the buildings is because those are the things that are there 24/7, right? Tanks, infantry, turrets. These things might be manned, might not be manned, depending on the hour of the day, time of the week, player count. But the buildings will always be there, right? And there's going to be a lot of them. Just historically, based on how people build, there's going to be a lot of buildings between you and the town hall that you're also going to need to blow up with, you guessed it, more HE damage, right? Um, and so, what I really want to impress on you is the way that I look at Foxhole and the way that I think you should look at Foxhole is it is a game about dealing HE damage to structures until victory, right? Until you have managed to capture a sufficient amount of the map to win. So let's ask another question, right? What are infantry? Uh, so on the screen there is my crude depiction of an inventory for an infantry soldier. This soldier is Jen. They're going to be our willing volunteer for all demonstrations going forward. Um, Defining an infantry isn't something that I'm going to do in like precise terms. If you need dictionary definitions in order to understand what infantry are, then you're probably doing the wrong thing. You're probably focusing a little bit too much on, you know, etymology and not so much on practicality. Uh, but in general, soldiers are the guys with the soldier uniforms who carry small arms and whose primary purpose, right, is to shoot guys and to throw grenades, right? Um, Generally speaking, soldiers operate individually, right? Um, this is really just to say that, like, you know, a guy who's running like a heavy machine gun, right? Maybe he's carrying a soldier outfit, but his inability to operate that machine gun effectively without a second person, as far as like picking up the weapon in the tripod, moving them to a new location, keeping himself stocked with ammunition, things like that, kind of relegates him to being something other than infantry, right? Infantry are ideally a self-contained unit. It doesn't mean that they work entirely independently, right? Obviously, you could have 8 or 9 infantry all working together, but if any given one of those infantry dies, it doesn't fundamentally stop the operation in the way that if, say, the driver of a tank gets killed, the tank no longer functions, right? It just can't be used without its full complement. So here we have Jen uh, doing the kind of engaged in the two roles of soldiering, right? At the top there, they're aiming a rifle. At the bottom, they're getting ready to throw a grenade. Uh, like I said on the last slide, these are the two roles of infantry in my mind. The first is to exert a zone of control through the use of their small arms, and the second is to throw grenades at stuff. There's 3 types of grenades. This is, kind of a rude summarization, but you got grenades that are meant to do HE damage, like Mammons, maybe satchels you include in this, maybe those new Tremola grenades. Um, the AT grenades, these are, flasks, the handheld RPGs, those sorts of things. And the anti-personnel grenades, bomba stones, harpas, that sort of stuff, right? Um, and obviously, right, you can see within the secondary role, right, HE grenades, Mammons, well, if the objective of the game is to deal HE damage, it would make a lot of sense if every soldier carried 1 or 2 Mammons on them, right? So that they can ideally get close enough to a building in order to deal HE damage, right? That is kind of the first and most obvious naive use of infantry. And yet, I've relegated it to the secondary role for reasons that we're about to discuss. Um, and the first kind of thing to note is while it is possible for a soldier to deal HE damage through Mammons, and that may be a a good role for infantry to fill, particularly in the early war periods. As we start unlocking other things like tanks and artillery, we're going to find that these things are far more capable of dealing HE damage safely compared to a soldier, right? The Mammon has an extremely short range. Soldiers are easy to kill. They're not great in terms of carrying large amounts of HE on them. It takes them longer to get to certain areas. And while they're dealing their damage, it's very easy to kill or disrupt them, right? By contrast, the other 2 primary means of dealing HE damage are tanks and artillery. Tanks with their 40 millimeter ammunition primarily, artillery usually with the 120, sometimes the 150, right? And these two have two separate uh, and sort of 2 separate approaches to having an advantage over the Mammon. They both just deal more damage and carry way more like raw points of damage per, say, you know, like a tank's complement of 40 millimeter shells vastly outstrips the amount of damage that a soldier is capable of carrying in one inventory, and similarly, a pallet of 120 shells is far more potential damage than that equivalent of Mammons. The artillery focuses largely on using the advantage of range to just shell enemies from a distance at which they cannot respond, with a high enough saturation of fire that they will tear the defenses down. The tanks are a little bit more surgical. heavily armored nature of them makes it harder for them to die. Their tracks makes it easier for them to maneuver, and that way they're able to just bring their HE damage where it is needed, right? Um, and the reason why I bring up these two examples, right, so soon after discussing soldiers is that while the objective of the game is to deal HE damage, the HE grenades of the soldiers are so inefficient compared to the alternative means of dealing HE damage that rather than the HE grenade being the primary role of the soldier, the HE grenade is honestly probably the last resort of the soldier, right? The anti-personnel grenades are certainly more valuable than the mammons are, and on top of that, the soldier's function in projecting zone of control is dramatically more important than either of the other two. And to highlight this, right, let's first think about the combined arms of artillery, right? Now, combined arms with artillery is something so natural that you probably don't even think about it, right? Combined arms is really just I've got two different means of fighting, and I'm going to try and do both of them at the same time in a way that serves one another. So a non-combined arms form of artillery would just be, if I stuck 3 to 5 artillery pieces in a field, and the only people on those guns were the loaders, uh, and the guys manning the thing, and like their one spotter, right? You can obviously see the problem with that. If those guys are just stuck in a field with absolutely nothing around them, right, uh, it takes about one guy with an anti-personnel grenade to run up there and disrupt the whole operation, right? Or one guy with a handful of mammoths to run up, blow up the pallet of 120, the whole thing falls apart, right? So combined arms with artillery is just sort of a natural thing. You when you deploy these guns, usually put them already behind dug defenses where there are soldiers, so that between those defenses and those soldiers, uh, your artillery isn't going to get destroyed like immediately. Um, so here we've got a picture of just a pretty simple, triangle setup of hexagons for artillery pieces, protected by a pretty basic trench with our volunteer gen sitting in it, right? Um, and in this role, right, rather than Jen being there to deal HE damage, Jen is sort of expected to deal no HE damage whatsoever. Jen's entire purpose, right, is to man these defenses, right? Uh, to prevent the enemy from getting close to the artillery or being able to disrupt their actions or do damage to them. And in that way, even though Jen isn't doing any HE damage, they are in essence enabling far more HE damage to get done than Jen could do on their own, right? Um, you see there, right? This is what we're going to call defense. I know, I know, you all are probably sighing like, do you really have to define the word defense for me? Just bear with me, right? Um, and again, I've been using this term several times now, but this barrier, right? The trench here forms kind of this barrier through which the enemies cannot proceed, right? Particularly without getting shot by Jen. And this is what we're going to call a zone of control, right? So what is a zone of control? That diagram on your right there is not a fancy Pokeball. It is actually sort of a crude depiction of how zone of control works from soldiers. Um, the way that I use it, a zone of control is specifically an area through which your enemy's infantry specifically can't move without getting shot at. Ideally, shooting at them will kill them, but this isn't a guaranteed thing, right? So here on this diagram, right? Whoop, here on this diagram, right? We've got Jen standing here in the center. This circle is defining the limit of where their weapon can shoot, right? That's our perimeter over here. I've got a dividing line here in the middle because if Jen is scoping in, looking in this direction, right? Jen's camera is panned such that Jen can't see this area behind them, right? So even though that is technically within their weapon's range, the stuff that exists to your side and behind you, you may be completely ignorant of. And if you can't see it, you can't shoot it, right? Similarly, even though Jen may be able to see everything over in this white area, and I know that's kind of, because of the way the camera mechanics work, this isn't really what Jen's zone of vision is, but you can see that, you know, the idea is there is only a small slice here, right? This cone that Jen can actually be aimed at and reacting to at any given point in time, right? If anything were to show up, say over in this left uh, white area, they would have to turn, right, and take at least a few seconds before they were able to actually be ready to fight something over there. So we've got kind of this dark gray area for things that are not really covered by the zone of control. We've got this white area of things that could be covered by the zone of control in time. And then we've got, lastly, this firing area where we've got this gradient, right? This gradient is what I'm calling pressure. Um, the idea is essentially think of it like a probability, and I know math stuff, but going from down here towards the red, if you were to try and move to this area, there'd be 100% chance that you would be shot and killed first, right? But as you're out here, moving through this area, maybe that's only 50%, 30%, right? The further away you are and the less time, this isn't just like it's harder to hit something further away, but also like being further away and not coming closer, right? Limits the amount of time that you're within the zone of control and also limits the probability that you're going to die. Um, I'm not going to get into this because this is way too much, but what like the size of this cone, the speed at which you can pivot it, how this sort of pressure looks is very much dependent on the weapon you have equipped, right? For example, a bolt action Lowcaster, right? It's got a much longer range, so this perimeter is sticking further out. However, its slower rate of fire means that the pressure it exerts is, rather than looking like this, right? It might be kind of white, 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 and then only red down towards this area, right? Um, by contrast, like with a submachine gun, right? A much smaller perimeter, but maybe it's red more the way out, and then it abruptly drops to being white as the bullets scatter too much to be effective, right? Um, the reason why I want you to think about this, right, is I want you to be thinking about infantry in terms of using their small arms to prevent enemies from entering an area by shooting at them. And I also want you to think about the fact that, like, this zone travels with you even as you move, but that, like, movement, cover, um, the weapon that you have, and even, like, sort of the enemies that you're facing all impact your ability to exert this pressure in that zone of control, right? These things are kind of dynamic, changing a lot as you move around on the battlefield. You don't have to think about them like, you don't have to be trying to calculate this, right? But just think about the fact that, maybe from the position that you're in, you're able to exert a zone of control over an area. Maybe you are using a bolt action, but you're a good shot, and so you're able to exhibit a lot of pressure. But you could easily be overwhelmed, right? Like, sure, maybe you are very likely to kill one or two guys moving through that area, but the bolt action simply limits you in a way that a machine gun wouldn't, in that you couldn't kill five or six, right? Um, Whereas an emplaced machine gun, maybe it doesn't have this like 360 looking, it can only do maybe like 120, right, from the place where it's emplaced, but it's far less likely to have its pressure be insufficient to handle even very, very large groups of soldiers, right? And the other big thing that I want you to think about with this is a soldier's ability to like project this zone of control is dependent on their ability to see things, right? The range, right, this perimeter is based on your weapon's range, but realistically, it is limited to your visual range. So during Foxhole, when the day-night cycle is shifting, your zone of control, like, comes in as the night goes on, to the point that even if you have the weapon range to shoot further, you can't really project a zone of control further unless you are just continually shooting at an area, right? Um, so just things I want you to think about. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about how I've shifted the role of infantry from HE to zone of control, right? Specifically, kind of in reference to the artillery, but also like now incorporating tanks. So the primary role of the infantry is to project this zone of control, right? Why? Because there are other things that are better at dealing HE damage than the infantry are, and those things don't need you to have mammons on you. What they need is for you to stop enemies from getting close enough to hurt them. The way that you stop those enemies from getting close enough to disrupt their activities is through projecting the zone of control, right? It is by posting at certain areas, watching for enemies to come through, and then shooting at them and killing them so that they can't get close enough to do what they need to do, right? Um, in addition, right, or kind of by contrast, it the zone of control, as I've stated it, right, it specifically applies to shooting at infantry with your small arms, right? Small arms are the things that fire, 7.62 bullets that kill infantry, but not anything else, right? A tank is not really subject to a zone of control, right? That's sort of one of the big beauties of tanks is that they're so heavily armored that they can just plow through small arms fire, and ignore the zone of control that the infantry have, right? So the infantry, no longer needing their mammons, are now best served by carrying as a backup whatever sort of anti-tank grenades they're capable of carrying, right? And this is because they want to be able to continue to enforce, um, maybe not as much as zone of control, because like infantry can't zone tanks in the same way that they can zone infantry. You know, if you get tagged, like if you get shot while trying to enter a zone of control, you're probably about to die. You're certainly going to be hurt. You cannot continue. You have to back up, right? With a tank, if an infantry unit shoots them, they, even if you hull a shot, they can still just leave, right? Destroying tanks usually requires ambushing them, tricking them into overcommitting so that they can be hit many times, right, simultaneously from many different positions, and hoping that you are able to also disable them to hold them in that position to deal even more damage to them over time, right? So rather than applying a zone of control to them, it's sort of more ambush tactics, but you can still see that, like, the infantry's new objective is, you know, post up, create the zone of control, and then to prevent the zone of control from being violated by tanks, carry anti-tank weapons that would, theoretically force those tanks to stay also at a distance from your artillery, right? Um, in this role, anti-personnel grenades are really not useful. Anti-personnel grenades tend not to be able to kill enemies that are in an open field, just because the enemies can see them coming and move out of the way. And so on defense, they really don't serve much of a purpose, because you can throw them blindly, but they're not going to really kill anyone or stop anyone from attacking you or anything of the sort, right? Obviously, if an enemy takes up like a really strong position and they're using that to pressure your defenses, you can throw a grenade up there to scatter them, but you know, this is going to be a whole nother thing. So, before we get there, let's talk about combined arms with tanks, right? As just stated, right, these anti-tank grenades, they're great for helping infantry sort of prevent tanks from violating their zone of control because they give the infantry a way to actually hurt the tank in a meaningful way. So what if, right, theoretically, someone were to take an anti-tank grenade and try to, hurt one of your tanks in a meaningful way? that thing that we just said that they were capable of doing, right? And this leads to a new form of combined arms, one that does not get practiced very well in Foxhole. It's largely because it's very difficult, and it's also because infantry tend not to want to support tanks because tanks demand too much of them without supporting them. Um, and tanks do not like to rely on infantry because infantry tend to flake on them because tanks tend not to support them. It's sort of a vicious cycle. We could get into that one too. But it's enough to say that the way that combined arms warfare with tanks works is pretty much the same way it did for artillery. The infantry are there to project a zone of control to make sure that enemy infantry with anti-tank weapons can't get close enough to your tanks to actually use them, right? So, for infantry in this role, the primary and kind of the only thing that you need to be worried about is make sure that no enemy infantry specifically get close to your tank, right? You don't have much of another role, right? Um, you could carry an anti-tank grenade with you in order to try and rush an enemy tank. You could carry anti-personnel grenades to try and clear trenches that are ahead of a tank. But like another problem that you're going to run into is tanks tend to operate at much further distances and for much longer periods of time than infantry can operate, right? They're able to carry a huge complement of 40 millimeter shells, which they can just keep using, for hours at a time. But for you, carrying even three anti-personnel grenades, that's kind of a lot, right? And you're going to encounter a lot of trenches if you keep pushing for a long period of time. Um, so you can carry grenades, but really, if you're working with a tank in coordination effectively and you're trying to overtake an area of defenses, the best thing to do would be to carry a few grenades, handle an objective, secure it, replenish your supplies, and then tackle the next objective, moving in piecemeal. Tankers don't like to do that. Tankers like to just go, press the advantage when they have it. But, if you're going to try and keep up with a tanker who's trying to press their advantage that hard, the best thing that you probably want to carry with you is like 3 bandages, right? I wouldn't really bother with the grenades because, frankly, there's it's going to be way too much going on for you to handle it, right? Um, but this also is, another kind of emphasis of why like grenades are a secondary role for infantry, right? Shooting enemy infantry, creating a physical zone which enemy infantry hopefully cannot exist within, right? In order to keep them away from your tank, you only need a gun to do that. And in fact, the gun's going to do that way better than any grenade ever will because when somebody walks in front of you and you have a gun, you can shoot them right now, whereas if you had an anti-personnel grenade, you can blow them up maybe in 3 to 5 seconds, which is a little bit too late for you. Um, and then by projecting that zone of control, by clearing out trenches, right, or whatever it is that you need to do, the tanks are able to move in close enough to the enemy structures to deal their damage. Um, so I want to introduce another question, right? Uh, we've kind of got this idea of HE is king, HE is the role of HE is the objective, right, within the game. The infantry best serve their HE best serve in dealing HE by protecting their HE damage dealers, and they are best at doing that specifically by creating these barriers, right, from the enemy to prevent the enemy from being able to disrupt their HE dealers, right? But, disrupt the enemy from what, we might ask, right? And especially in the case of tanks, right? We have this anti-tank grenade, um, and is that anti-tank grenade really serving us as a defensive tool or as an offensive tool, right? Because the way that I am talking about this so far, you may get the impression that the role of the infantry is to stay in one place and just defend it, right? But if both infantry adhered to that theory, entirely relying on their small arms and not wanting to attack ever, right, there'd be nothing to defend any of your things from, which would kind of imply that, like, the role of infantry, rather than being small arms, is to attack, tanks with their anti-tank grenades, right? Um, and so, this slide is kind of discussing that, right? Like, which of these two perspectives is the correct use of infantry? Is it, Jen on the left trying to exert a zone of control to stop this colonial from throwing an anti-tank grenade at this warden tank, or is the colonial in the right that the role of infantry is to attack tanks using anti-tank grenades, right? Because infantry are a fairly effective way to pressure tanks, specifically because they can deal anti-tank damage, and the tanks have a much harder time killing large amounts of infantry, right? Remember back to our idea of the pressure exerted from a zone of control. A tank has a lot of range on that perimeter and a high ability to kill one target that moves through it, but its ability to exert pressure against a group of enemies is fairly low, unless it has a machine gun. And even then, a lot of those machine gun turrets are fixed in the direction that they can look, meaning that they can still be overwhelmed by those attacks coming from areas that they just can't look at, right? And so, to try and clear up this notion of like, you know, is the role of infantry to protect, to sit in one place with their small arms and protect it, or is maybe the role of infantry more aggressive in nature? Uh, we're going to have to talk about what is defense? Like, what does it mean to defend something? And this is why I was saying before that, oh man, do you really have to, like, tell me that the purpose of a trench is for defense? I, I kind of do. Um, Down in the bottom there, you've got a pretty simple series of trench works. I've drawn little circles just to kind of roughly approximate projected zones of control from infantry occupying those trenches, right? But the purpose of this is to convey to you that, like, the idea of defense is entirely about closing off possible courses of action from the enemy, right? The importance here, the reason why this is defense is not because there are trenches, it's not because there are zones of control, right? Those things are in service of what the defense is. And what the defense is stopping an enemy from being able to move through this gap, right? It is denying the enemy a potential course of action. The enemy can't move through here to maybe attack another target or to get around something, right? And that closing off of potentialities is what defense is. Um, and so when we talk about like combined arms and using your small arms in order to protect tanks, this is a defensive action even if the tank is rolling forward to attack the enemy, because the role of those infantry supporting the tanks is not really it's not to attack the building, it's not to shoot anything, right? Their role is specifically to cut off the potential for the enemy to do something, and to do something very specific, throw a grenade at their tank, right? And in order to accomplish that, they obviously, sweep for enemies, try to spot them, and then shoot them, right? But their like tactical objective is defensive in nature. Stop the enemy from being able to take a course of action, right? Um, Doing this is difficult. Defenses, kind of by their nature, because there's so many potential avenues, often require a lot of manpower in order to work. So, if you want to stop somebody from throwing a grenade at your tank, it's not going to take, it takes one person to throw the grenade. It takes probably at least four people to like reasonably stop them from doing that. And that's because if you put only one person on the job, right, say that person stands to the left of the tank, well, now they've prevented you from throwing a grenade from the left side of the tank, but not from the right side. And so, in order to close off like a range of possibilities, it takes a lot more personnel, material, resources, and time um, than maybe is going to be spent trying to do the thing. That said, you know, we may have to spend 5, 10 soldiers and 5 or 10 minutes digging, right, in order to say secure a trench line from which we can start using an artillery battery, right? So we're taking 10 people and a lot of time and a lot of resources in order to essentially stop one guy from throwing one grenade. However, as a consequence of that, because that one guy can't throw that one grenade, our artillery can now operate unmolested and do an insane amount of damage, right? So just because it's a massive investment doesn't necessarily mean that that it isn't going to pay off for us, right? But we do have to be aware that like defense being about shutting down possibilities does cost more manpower and resources than the thing that it's trying to stop. Um, and at the bottom there, something that probably is obvious to everybody: defense is not about killing an enemy, right? Okay, so that explains why the zones of control, that explains everything up until this point, but still, what about the theory that if we're trying to stop someone from throwing a grenade at one of our tanks, there's got to be somebody trying to throw a grenade at one of our tanks? So what is offense then, right? And I want to hammer this home. Offense is not the opposite of defense. And I know that sounds crazy, but think back to our tank, right? The soldiers standing around that tank with their guns out, ready to shoot enemies coming at them. Those soldiers are on defense, right? However, the tank itself, right, is on offense. These two things are co-occurring with each other. And in fact, right, the soldiers are on defense until the moment that an enemy actually walks into range, right? The second an enemy steps up to try to throw a grenade at them, the soldiers are now both on defense, shutting down that possibility, and on offense, shooting the enemy and killing them, right? Um, so here I've got, I'm an attempt at a definition that offense is the expenditure of resources to realize a permanent change, right? It is defense for me to stand around my tank and try to, make it impossible for an enemy to walk into this space with and throw a grenade on my tank. It is offense, however, for me to actually shoot them, right? Because in shooting them and killing them, I am realizing a permanent change, which is to say, my tank is now, probably that was the only guy stopping my tank from advancing another 5 or 10 meters and starting opening fire on another building, right? So in that sense, shooting that guy is both offense and defense. It is the performing of the defense and the realization of an offensive objective, which is clearing the road for the tank, right? Um, Offense, kind of as noted with the defense, like defense is often about spreading out resources in order to deny as many possibilities as possible. Offense is therefore usually involved in concentrating resources into one specific area in order to achieve a particular goal. Um, I write down that this is a permanent change. Obviously, nothing is, really truly permanent, but like offense is not uh, a sniper shooting a medic in the back line, right? Because that's not going to change anything. That guy's just going to respawn, grab more kit, come right back out, whatever. Who cares, right? Offense is shooting a medic and then while he's respawning, pressing an objective because you know that the enemies are going to suffer attrition and they won't be able to hold the defense and you'll be able to overwhelm it, take that position, and then hold it against the enemy, right? A sort of permanent change, right? Something about the way that this battle is going to progress has changed because of the thing that you did. Um, Offense, however, offense because of this rather is not about killing the enemy, right? It is about obtaining an objective, right? Offense is not so much about killing the enemies who are in that trench as it is clearing that trench, making it safe so that tanks can move further up this area, or so that, even for infantry, so that your infantry can get close enough to start mammoning something, right? Or maybe just so you can whatever, rip the defenses off of it and make it more advantageous to your position, right? Or maybe you just kill enemies in an area so you can dig a trench, right? But the point is, the killing of those guys is not the important part. Um, and so, to bring it back, right? Is an anti-tank grenade offensive or defensive? And I think the answer is it can be offensive. It is entirely possible to say, look, the enemy tanks are currently sitting somewhere, and we should get anti-tank grenades together, advance on that position, and attempt to destroy those tanks in order to impact a permanent change, namely, there's no armor on this front, or there's less armor to oppose us, right? Um, However, I think that in general, um, the larger advantage to anti-tank grenades is their ability to serve in a defensive capacity, preventing tanks from moving through an area which infantry already hold. This is because those anti-tank rushes are hard to coordinate. They usually aren't super effective, mostly because tanks at rest tend to sit in places that are safe for them. They can see troops coming from a ways away. They can just leave. Um, it's not to say it's impossible. It's not to say it's something that shouldn't be practiced, but just like the way I think about it is the anti-tank grenade is more about preventing a tank from entering and violating a space that was protected by zone of control by driving them off with the anti-tank grenades, right? You're more likely to use an anti-tank grenade sitting in a trench waiting for a tank to overcommit than you are rushing a tank that's already potentially protected by other zones of control, right? Um, However, when my computer loads it, there we go. Now I'm going to talk about the third tool, right? The third type of grenade. Um, and this is kind of the purest form of offense that infantry have access to. And it is the anti-personnel grenade. As it turns out, for the most part, the offensive actions taken by infantry are by and by and large going to be against other infantry, right? And in order to achieve this, infantry are going to use primarily anti-personnel grenades. Um, it is possible, right, to simply move into an enemy zone of control and then kill him, right? It can happen. Uh, you can get flanked. You could just lose the gunfight. It's possible. Usually, defenders will win simply because they've got their weapons ready, stabilized. They're able to take that first shot as soon as the enemy gets within range. Defenders have a tendency to pick long range weapons because, their ability to help stabilize them and their work from a protected area means that what they want is range on them, whereas attackers, because they need to move, tend to favor more maneuverable weapons that will either not bloom as much with their shots or will retain their stability better, and those weapons tend to be shorter range submachine guns, right? um, so usually a defender is going to just win against small arms, but it isn't strictly true. However, when a defender is dug into a position that you can't attack otherwise, or flank, or you just don't want to try and risk it, the anti-personnel grenade becomes the tool of choice, right? Um, Anti-personnel grenades, in keeping with the offensive theory, right, are not really about killing the enemy, right? Anti-personnel grenades are about getting the enemy to leave an area, right? Whether that be by killing them or simply making them run away. Throwing an anti-personnel grenade into a trench, right? We got Jen down here throwing a harpa into this trench, and in doing so, Jen doesn't really care whether the enemies leave or die, right? The objective is make sure that this trench has nobody in it. Because if there was somebody in this, there's absolutely no way Jen could like move through this area without getting shot. So it denies the zone of control. Um, and in doing so, it also helps like attain that next objective. So, if Jen in this situation pitches this Harpa grenade in here and then does nothing, right? Throws the grenade into the trench and then wipes their hands and is like, all right, well, I'm going home. That doesn't really accomplish anything as far as offense, right? It's not an offensive action, it's just doing stuff, right? Pushing buttons. Um, Whereas if Jen throws that grenade and then follows up by trying to occupy that trench and hopefully succeeding, that is an offensive action, right? Denying the enemy the trench that they once had and then occupying it against them so that they can't resume that defensive position. Um, Sorry, lost my train of thought. Let's keep moving. Uh, all right. So all of this, right? What is the objective of the game? How do we deal HE damage? What is the zone of control? How do we consider offense and defense? What is the role of soldiers largely within offense and defense? All of this really is because there are some people who believe that when defending a trench, you should not ever abandon the trench. That the trench is sort of a one-way street. Um, and I think a lot of people have this mentality. You can see this mentality a lot of times when people build trenches that don't have stairs in them. You don't need stairs to get out of a trench because your expectation is you're going to die in the trench. And so I've phrased this as, should you stand next to grenades? Now, that's maybe not the most charitable way to phrase this argument, but I will point out there are some times when you should. Uh, if someone throws a grenade into your trench and, you know, you're manning the heavy machine gun and there's a push, frankly, you should probably stay. You should probably stay and gun down as many people in that push as you can. Try to disrupt it so that it won't be able to succeed in attaining a lasting objective. The same thing goes for if somebody is about to overwhelm your trench, but you might have an opportunity to throw an anti-tank grenade at a tank that might track it. Probably stay, right? So should you stand next to grenades? Honestly, sometimes yes. However, I don't think that people should be of the opinion that that is a that is not your default reaction. You should not assume that the right thing is to die in the trench. In fact, in almost every real scenario you're going to wind up in, the correct move is to save your own life. Um, and I'm going to explain why, hopefully. So, I'm borrowing a term. Uh, Deal with it. Uh, we're going to talk about my idea, which I'm calling elastic defense, right? Or why you should run away. um, so, as discussed, the objective of the game is to deal HE damage. You as infantry, you're not the guy meant to deal that HE damage. Your purpose is to enforce a zone of control. Now, that may sound like, hey, there are a lot bigger things going on here. It is way more important to retain the integrity of the zone of control than it is for you to stay alive. And that's correct. However, you can't enforce a zone of control if you're dead. And I don't think a lot of players think about it because, a 15 or a 30-second timer isn't really that punishing for them. But if you are defending a tank, right? Let's say you're out accompanying a tank and someone is rushing you and it's a bad position, right? They've got an angle on you that you weren't expecting. You aren't prepared to take this fight. You have one of two options. You can stand there and die, in which case you are no longer exerting your zone of control, right? And maybe you've delayed the enemy an additional 2, 3 seconds, something like that. Or you could run away, like maybe to the side of the tank, something like that, something to save your own life. In doing so, you are still denying the zone of control, but you're still alive to keep shooting at the enemies, right? Wherever you manage to run away to, you can start exerting a new zone of control from that position. And you can even say, run, which maybe the enemy says, here's my opportunity. They pull out their grenade, and you can turn back around and start shooting at them, right? It's worse than if you had not had that guy outflank you and get the drop on you, but it's way better than if you die and are all of a sudden a minute and 30 seconds away from being able to support the tank. And I think this goes in pretty much all instances of defenses, right? If you know that you are actually beaten from an area, and by that I mean like you are about to die, right? Give up. Go somewhere else. Save your own life if you're capable of doing it. Because, like in this example here, right? The spawn point is somewhere down here, maybe even off screen. If you die, you're going to start way down here 10 seconds from now and then have to resume the defense. It would be so much better if you were anywhere up here, right? In this case, we have, here's one trench that's being assaulted. So sort of our area which our defenders control has shrunk because they've lost this trench. Rather than having the defenders of this trench die in this trench, I'm arguing the best move is for them to pull out, go somewhere else, keep themselves alive, because then they're able to help project a new zone of control, or maybe even counterattack and regain what they just lost, right? Um, so like in this instance, say this trench here on the left is getting bombarded, right? It's taken 5, 6, 7 anti-personnel grenades. This is something that you'll see sometimes, especially if, I mean, I never play Colonials, so maybe this happens to Colonials too, but especially when you're playing Wardens, let me tell you, sometimes the Colonials just make it rain bomb stones on a trench that you're standing in. Don't go into that trench. Don't stay in that trench, right? However, once the last grenade has stopped going off and you don't see any more flying, like, immediately start trying to get that trench back. And because you didn't just throw your life away, right? Because you preserved your life when you had the opportunity, you will be in a position to get there potentially even faster than the guys who are trying to take the trench from you to begin with. And this is like a big reason why stairs become important, because those anti-personnel grenades, right? Remember how I said they're fantastic, they're really solid at attacking these like entrenched positions. They're really good as tools of offense in order to overcome these really hard positions to crack, right? Because the defenders have sunk so much time and resources into like stacking the deck in their favor. A grenade is a great, cheap, simple way to level the playing field again. But at the point that you aren't in the trench anymore, throwing a grenade at somebody in a field is still as ineffective as ever, right? They might only need 2 or 3 grenades to clear this trench, but to stop you from hanging out right behind the trench would take 15, 20 of them. They'd have to creep a barrage of grenades that just saturates an ever widening area, right? They'd start having to effectively use anti personnel grenades defensively to deny you the possibility of getting back into the trench. And as stated, anti personnel grenades are trash at a defensive concept, right? So, and if you're able to get back into that trench after the 10 bomb stones have gone off, right? You have essentially made all of those grenades that they just threw completely worthless, right? The point of an offensive action is to effect a permanent change, not to get you out of the trench for 5 seconds or 10 seconds, but to like get you out of the trench and then take that trench over or blow it up, right? So if you just go back in there, right, because you're alive to do so, you wind up just completely wiping out everything that they've done, right? And there is not, right, like what you gain by say you have a trench like this bottom one, right? Where I'm just doing a simple diagram, but let's say that there are no staircases like there should be here and here and maybe over here and over here, right? it becomes a whole lot easier to like shell enemies out of the trench this way by just creeping a bombardment of grenades along this trench, right? And then get into it, as opposed to if there had been ways for those troops to get back out, right? Those troops can now be up behind here on sandbags manning the defenses. Um, so let's look a little bit more seriously at like how to actually defend a trench, right? This is a diagram of Jen again, actually performing the form of defense that I'm talking about, right? Jen is initially in this trench. Somebody throws a bomb stone into the trench. Jen could sit in the trench and hope that before that bomb stone goes off and kills them, somebody is going to just walk forward and get shot, right? But that's fairly unrealistic. The first thing Jen should care about is, right, unless Jen is actively in the process of stopping a push, right? Like if Jen is sitting here on like I said, on a heavy machine gun, just mowing down a mammon rush, right? All right, fine. Just stay there, right? Just stand next to the grenade and die because it's more important to stop the rush, right? However, if what Jen is doing is sitting here on night guard, right? Not able to see shit, and a grenade just materializes in the night and comes flying towards the trench, right? Yeah, just leave, right? Just get out of the trench and save yourself. And this is like another great reason to have these sandbags along the back is Jen doesn't have to go far. No matter where the grenade lands in this trench, Jen has to take approximately a 2-second sprint and is immediately back behind full cover. It's not going to have like the defilade and it's not going to have the back wall cover that the trench did, but it's still got the full mechanical cover, and that's kind of a lot, right? Um, so like when you're defending trenches, this to me is the correct way to use them. Is at first you want to just occupy them, probably with only one or two soldiers, right? Don't just pile everybody in there. But you occupy them, you project your zone of control. You're projecting that zone of control with the intention of keeping enemies from whatever it is, right? uh, Being able to reach your artillery, being able to reach your tanks. Maybe you're just trying to stop them from being able to infiltrate further defenses, right? Because it's entirely valid to have infantry defenses that are just there to protect other more important infantry defenses because, hey, why why put all your eggs in one basket? Why risk the enemy overwhelming the one necessary trench when you can force them to overwhelm, 3 or 4, right? Um, and then if you are hit with pressure that would kill you, right, retreat the minimum distance necessary, or withdraw the minimum distance necessary, right, in order to resume a new safe fighting position. And then, as soon as you are able, reoccupy the space that you just had to give up, right? This doesn't make it impossible for the enemy to like whatever, throw bomb stones into the trench and then immediately rush with other soldiers, and force you off of even the sandbags because maybe you just can't fight, right? But like force the enemy to do those hard coordinated tactics, right? Whenever you have the opportunity, just exert your zone of control, right? Maybe Jen sees the grenade coming and just fires, right? Just takes a random shot because Jen's going to have like a second at least, right? Before they have to sprint out of the trench. So maybe Jen just takes one shot because who knows? Maybe it's going to hit somebody out there and maybe that's going to prove to be a problem in terms of them being able to follow up on the attack. Maybe when Jen gets back here, there's already infantry rushing, right? So Jen can't really hold this position, but Jen still takes a shot or two before running off into the night, right? It's about exerting your zone of control as much as you can without dying, withdrawing or giving up only as much as you have to in order to preserve your life, and then quickly surging back into that area, with a counterattack as fast as you can to make sure that the enemy isn't able to actually like make good on their offensive action. Um, Here on this slide, right, this is just a continuation of that idea, right? So Jen originally in the trench, forced out by a grenade, now probably getting rushed by infantry, maybe just getting bombed with more grenades, pulls back to ideally another trench, right? Another defensive position that has already been prepared. Um, this isn't necessarily always going to be there. Sometimes people just don't have time to build them. Sometimes people just don't think to build them or they can't, right? But try and be aware of like, hey, if I were to be forced out of this trench, how would I get out? Where would I go, right? What is the shortest distance I could travel before I could start fighting again? Um, and, you know, there's other advantages to falling back as well, right? Suppose, like, Jen's up here all alone in this trench, but maybe back here there's already another soldier or another two soldiers, right? Because Jen is alive, Jen is now able to participate in the next line of defense. Even if the enemy have completely overwhelmed this one and there's no hope of counterattacking, just being there with more soldiers in the next area is going to make it all the harder for the enemy to keep capitalizing on their attack or to like maintain momentum. It makes it easier for us to sort of dig in and slow them down, right? Um, you should, if possible, get help, right? Make sure that your microphone is set up well before you start playing the game. Know how to activate it, and when somebody comes and tries to blow up your trench, and you can't hold it, run backwards to the nearest friendly position, get on the mic, and say, "Hey, there's enemies up over in whereversville," right? Use a cardinal direction, and get people to come up with you to go and fight those guys and drive them off, right? Maybe you can't handle this situation on your own, but you might be able to handle it with 3 or 4 other people, right? And similarly, when someone comes to you saying, "Holy crap, there's enemies over in whereversville," unless you are actively engaged in projecting a needed zone of control over an area, consider going to help, right? Being reactive on defense is one of the most important things that you can do. Offense being all about concentrating resources locally to overwhelm defensive positions, right, really suffers when the defenders respond by concentrating their own resources, right? Maybe they, a team of like 5 enemies is trying to overcome your team of 10. Your team of 10 is strung out so wide that all 5 of those enemies are able to attack one position where only one person is defending. But if that one person is able to call for help and get even 2 other people to show up, the odds have been evened dramatically for the defenders, right? Um, and really, you should also think and be prepared to counterattack. Um, So if they manage to get into your trench, right, drive you off, you run back to a friendly position, and you either realize they're not continuing to pursue you, or they do pursue you and you kill them and you break that attack, don't just give up the position that you've lost, right? Push back out and try to take it back from them. And the faster you do that, the better, because the faster you do that, the harder it is for the enemy to have effected any kind of permanent change that would make that position defensible to them, right? If you've seen my other videos, right, this minimal trench here, this is all about making it really hard for the enemy to defend it and really easy for you to attack it, because the enemy can't sit in here and shoot at you as you're approaching them, but you can just walk right up to the sandbag wall and kill them. So any enemies who are trying to defend this trench they just took from you are going to have to do it from outside of the trench. And that's a much more advantageous fight for you than it might have otherwise been. It's still possible to say, look, there's like 20 enemies. It's not worth going back up there right now. But consider that, even just walking up there and harassing them, just shooting at them a little bit, right, is better than just letting them have their way and waiting for them to figure out what they're going to do next. Um, and so this has been like just just the longest winded um, explanation of why you shouldn't stand next to a grenade. Um, and that's kind of responding to a few things that I had seen. Plus, I wanted to talk about how to use a trench. And then this final bit here, and then we're going to close it out. This is like a real world scenario that I saw on the battlefield. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to capture any photos of it. And this front line was a little bit massive, but I felt like this sort of encompassed a number of the different elements of like offense and defense and how to effectively use trenches. So I wanted to bring it up. Um, so down here, right, these squares are really just stand-ins for a concrete fort. that we were defending. Um, Fairly standard meta stuff, very high HP sponges. You've got barbed wire fences, kind of in a staggered, but not like straight. It wasn't impossible to pass through them. Scattered woods here on the left. Uh, and what had happened was, right, this was originally an empty field. A large, coordinated attack rolled up on this fort, quickly dug kind of this sort of long arcing trench. It had a few kinks in it, so it wasn't quite as open up as it looks here. Um, they put barbed wire along the front, except for down in this little corner. Sandbagged along the back of it. They had these two heavy machine gunners here, and essentially what they were planning to do was bring up maybe like 20 mortar guys and just mortar these huge concrete bunkers down. Um, which I thought was like kind of ingenious. Like it was a ton of coordination they had to do, but considering this is early war before there were even 120 millimeters, this was the best form of artillery they had, and they were using it really effectively. And you can see this is already like everything that I was talking about in terms of HE damage and zones of control. This is all playing into that, right? Their plan was move up into an area, right? Using their infantry and a few armored cars that they had, secure this area so that they could perform an offensive action in digging this trench, right? The purpose of digging this trench is emplacing these machine guns, and then they had, some scattered soldiers in here in order to enforce a zone of control to stop us from moving into this field down here. They had to do that so that their mortars could safely operate from behind the trench in order to start dealing artillery HE damage to a building, right? And in fact, the way that this worked out, the biggest counterplay that we had to these guys was waiting until nighttime when all of their zone of control, especially on the heavy machine gunners, had been substantially reduced, and then rushing from kind of both these sides up into up into this area in front of the trench and lobbing grenades over the front of the trench and into their mortar teams, right? Because their mortar teams couldn't scatter, the anti-personnel grenades were able to actually kill them, right? And in killing them, it disrupted their ability to fire, and this weird like combination of we're defending these concrete bunkers, but we're defending them by taking an offensive action by affecting the permanent change of there are no more guys alive to shoot mortars at our defenses anymore, right? Um, and I thought it was just a really clean demonstration of like how to use trenches effectively. A lot too of the strength of what they did was using this barbed wire, right? I may have downplayed barbed wire a little bit in the past. Um, Barbed wire is a fantastic tool as far as a defensive tool. It's not really important as far as the trench goes, if that makes sense. Barbed wire doesn't really keep a trench any more or less secure. Um, not not like on an individual level, right? But for the purposes of something like this, where the trench isn't just a fighting position, the trench is a defensive piece, stopping the enemy from being able to attack your artillery. The barbed wire, sorry, the barbed wire became a really important tool. Um, that barbed wire was really shutting down our ability to like pressure these mortars even more than we were because we just couldn't move through this area, right? It shut down the possibility of just advancing on the mortars, which was great. Uh, the trench that they built wound up being long enough, and because of these heavy machine gunners, we really couldn't like mass up enough, and so down here in the corner, this is a little trench I was trying to dig to sneak in there. It was not very good. It wasn't at a great angle. As you can see, like there's not you don't get as much cover as you really ought to from these heavy machine guns. Um, I kind of was hoping that we were out of range of them, but also there was other construction and woods down here that were just blocking, making anything better. Um, so that thing poking out of there is the corner of me trying to help us get closer to start doing something to these guys. It really didn't work out. Um, but like, but you could see that like the way that they worked that defense, the way that they used that trench was really effective, and they didn't need to use these staircases quite as much, which I think is fine. Like, you know, the way that they had built them was such that like this is a full trench length and then it's going into the middle of another standard trench. Doing that puts the staircase really far away. But I think they wanted that so that they could, kind of do these sandbags. Sorry about that again. So they could do these sandbags up this side, right? Just to make it a little bit, if we got in here and tried running down here and rounding the corner, we wouldn't have a clean shot straight into their mortar pocket. That's fairly smart. Um, However, like they probably could have made those a little bit shorter if they were worried about grenade spam because of the heavy machine guns and just the way that everything was positioned. It was really hard for us to amass any sort of like effective counteraction that would be able to like spam grenades at them and make that important. Instead, what we were really limited to was just coming up along this side and through these trees and just sort of using the cover of night to sprint as fast as we could, close enough to lob a grenade into that pocket of mortars. But had it been the case that maybe we had another 5, 10 players, um, and maybe we were able to get like a trench that actually went along here, um, it certainly could have been the case that we might have been able to mass up enough in order to throw grenades over, kill their heavy machine guns, and then get out of our trench and rush in. And in fact, this area down here, this one doesn't have barbed wire on purpose. This one was just for whatever reason they hadn't got around to barbed wiring it. Um, and we had a field day with that because this area down here was enough for us to keep this space empty so that we could run up there, throw grenades into that unbarbed wire section of trench, and then rush in. And then this was kind of after the mortars had already, I think, given up for the day. But that proved to be really effective as far as giving us an in for quickly getting into the trench and kind of keeping them like on a back foot where they didn't really want to keep operating because, instead of having this whole field clear of enemies like they wanted, they had a bunch of blue wardens down here constantly trying to like get in further into the trench or get around those stairs, which a really scary and not great place to be if you want to convince a lot of guys carrying a ton of mortars to move up into this area. Um, and so, you know, did they follow my way of defending this trench? No, they didn't. And they didn't have to. They did a great job. They were able to just enforce their zone of control so strongly that they didn't really have to care about the idea of like layering defenses. They were clearly, because they were trying to make this attack happen, they were in a little bit of a rush. So trying to dig like layers would not have been effective. The mortars would have to be up front just because of their shorter range. And you know the way that the fight unfolded, they really did need to commit to just holding that one line for as long as possible. But that said, they did still implement a lot of the other principles, right? Putting in sandbags, putting in stairs, barbed wiring the front of these areas, putting bends into their trenches to make it harder for us to just, move straight through them, and then using all of that to help them, put defensive pressure to stop us from coming in and interfering with them. It was great. It was huge to see. Um, so in conclusion, I've been rambling for quite some time now. Uh, as infantry, get good with your small arms and get good at uh, projecting a zone of control around you. Value your own life. Don't just throw it away. Understand that that you standing where you are with your gun is a pretty valuable thing. And, while it hurts the team for you to have to back up a few yards, it's still a lot better than getting sent back to spawn. Um, the area that you hold is sort of the value that you contribute to the team. You don't want to give it up, but dying gives up way, way more than you could possibly give up by just running away. Um, Protect your HE dealers. Um, Make sure that like when you give ground, you give as little as possible, and make sure, especially, that you practice like turning as quickly as you can. Uh, so turn quickly to get out of a bad situation and save your life, but also um, once you've reached a point where you're like, okay, now I can fight, try to identify that as fast as possible, and then turn around and either counterattack or just resume the defense as best you can. Uh, Probably barbed wire the front of your trenches. It seems to be real good in a way that maybe I haven't emphasized before. Um, and Remember that you can learn how to do this better than I can. Um, I don't play all that often. I am not like the most inspired guy when it comes to digging trenches or coming up with ideas. Um, I'm a lot better at talking about stuff than I am at doing it. So like, you know, go out there, practice some stuff. Feel free to come back and correct me on things. It is possible for you to learn these things and to learn to do them quite well in a fairly short amount of time. Um, Make sure you take care of yourself in game and out of it. Uh, and I will see you all whenever I manage to record another one.